out from the thing on behind me, we are starting a new series today called Closing My Big Fat Mouth. Yes, I know. What we're going to do is over the next couple of weeks, we're going to talk about the problem of lying and criticizing and gossip. But tonight, we're going to talk about complaining. You see, when I think about complaining in the Bible, the first place my mind goes back is the Old Testament to think about God's chosen people, the Israelites, who, when they were in captivity as slaves for hundreds of years, complained and complained and complained. And then when God finally rescued them, they complained some more. He issued 10 measure plagues to turn the heart of Pharaoh. He led them through the Red Sea. He drowned the Pharaoh's army. He fed people with bread and from heaven and water from rocks. And they were never satisfied. They always wanted more. Their clothes never ran out. They griped, they whined, they complained. In fact, at one point they complained so much that God said, fine, you want meat? I'll give you meat. And he just pounded them with quail. Just covered the land. In fact, in Exodus 14, verse 11, they say to Moses, was it because there are no graves in Egypt that you brought us here to die? What have you done to us bringing us out of Egypt? We were so happy when we were slaves. But now you brought us out of there. Didn't we say to you in Egypt, leave us alone, let us serve the Egyptians? We're happy serving the Egyptians. It's been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert. You know what? I've been in church ministry for almost 30 years. And I'm going to tell you right now, I've heard that more often than I care to tell you. Oh, not necessarily those words. But the word you cringe the most for when you're in ministry is somebody will look at you and say, well, we've never done it that way before. Really? Well, maybe you should. Or we were happy doing it that way, and now you brought all these new people in, and now we're having problems, you know. We were happy just being 10 or 12 people and complaining about not having enough money to pay the bills. But we were happy that way, and now you've got all this stuff, and God's done all this through you, and we just don't want, we want to go back to the way we were. You know, people like to complain. People enjoy complaining. And then Moses looks at them, and what does he say? He said this about our complaining, and it should be about us too, but he said this to the Egyptians. You're not just grumbling against me. You're complaining against the Lord. You're complaining against God. You know, it's not just our circumstances or about the traffic or about another person, but what if, in God's eyes, when we grumble and complain about our circumstances, we're actually complaining about Him? Perhaps that's the way He sees it. See, the reality is that we like to complain. I've got a friend of mine. It doesn't matter how well things are going. He's got to find something to complain about. And if everything's perfect and nothing's going wrong, he's not happy. But the reality is that when we grumble, when we complain about the circumstances, remember, God is sovereign. God is in control. God is in command. And if we truly believe that, then what we're saying is, I don't like what you're doing, God. I don't like the circumstances you've got me in. I don't like my job. I don't like my wife. I don't like my kids. I don't like my dog. I don't like the money you give me. I don't like, any of that stuff. And it's all your fault, God, because you're sovereign. Oh, we never come right out and say that. But that's what we're saying when we complain. We're telling God that He, sovereign God, in command of all things, screwed up. And I'm sorry. But I wonder what God thinks of us when we sit there and complain and moan and grumble, and He's in control of everything. one of the things I want to do today is I want to look at, what do you complain most about? I want you to personalize it so that you'll hear this message through the lens of your own complaining. What is the thing that you complain most about? And I want you to think about it and be real honest. And you don't need to tell me. Let it kind of rise to the surface. And for me, the thing that I probably complain most about is money. I never have enough money to pay the bills. I never have money to do this. I never have money to do that. And whatever, I complain about it. And you'll hear me complain, wah, 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 poor, pitiful me. What is it that you think you complain most about? Some of you would say, well, because you're not married. I wish I was married. And the other rest of you who are married, you say, I wish I wasn't married. Or you complain about your kids. Maybe it's that you complain about money, like I do. And money's tight, or the house is so small that your boss and your boss is driving you crazy. And it might be something smaller that you complain about, that the weather is bad, or the Wi-Fi is slow, or there's a lag in Second Life, or there's nothing to watch on TV and you're bored. And I want to go ahead and just clarify this and hope that you'll understand that the problem isn't the weather. The problem isn't that Netflix hasn't come out with new original content that meets your approval rating. The problem is that we've taken our eyes off the goodness of God and we placed our eyes dead center on what? Ourselves. You see, complaining is a self problem. It's an I issue. This is the problem that leads to constant curses of complaining. Because we're never satisfied, because who's at the center of our existence? Me. I'm there. I'm at the center of my existence, and so therefore, it doesn't matter what God wants. It doesn't matter where God is in this. All I complain about is what's comfortable for me. And I run around and go, wah, 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 wah. And so we sit at the dead center. And so our problem is an I problem. Now, I'm not talking about an EYE problem. I'm talking about an I problem, the letter I. I had a buddy of mine, pastor in a church, and he just got so tired of the backbiting and the arguing. And you get that sometime in churches, and he finally said, I'm going to do something about this. So he was preaching a series on Corinthians, and he decided, he announced one Sunday morning that they were going to have a funeral next week. And so people showed up for church on Sunday, and of course there's this coffin in the front of the church. Coffin's closed. And he gets up and he announces that he's preaching, that they're having a funeral today, and that he was going to and so he talked about death to self and all this stuff, and he says, now, the person who's caused all the problems in our church is laying in that coffin. And so what I want you to do is I'm going to open the coffin, and you come by and pay your final respects. He never told anybody who was in the coffin. So people would go by and they'd look in the coffin, and they'd come away, and some of them looked kind of mad, some of them were crying, some of them just shocked. Well, what he'd done is he'd put a 6-foot-long mirror in the bottom of that coffin. And so when they looked in, the only person they saw was themselves. So what I want to do today is I want to look at a text that to me just blows me away. It's written by the Apostle Paul, and if there's anyone who had a right to complain, it would be Paul. He certainly was him. If there's anybody, certainly the Apostle Paul. The top thing on his bucket list, it was more than a bucket list. It was what he felt God to do, was to go to Rome and preach the gospel. And so he knew if he could go to Rome and reach the leaders in Rome, that he could have a chance of impacting the whole world. Okay? Which is what his heart's desire was. And at the top of his list of things he wanted to accomplish in life was to go to Rome and preach. Instead, he was arrested, hauled off to Rome, and held as a prisoner. And not just a prisoner, he was locked up for about 2 years, locked 24 hours a day, chained to different Roman guards, awaiting his very possible execution. And I'll be honest, put me in that place, and I'd go in there as a preacher, and I'd be there as a prisoner, and I'm locked up, and I've been serving God, and I'm going to get so, and I'm going to complain, right? This isn't fair. Why are you not allowing this to happen? I've served you. I've been faithful. And on Apostle Paul, I can say, well, I've been shipwrecked. I've been bitten by snakes. I've been left for dead. All I've done to serve you. Serve you, serve you. Look at me, God. I'm so important to you because I've served you all this time. And you know how strategic the city is. And if you just give me a shot at the city, we can make a difference here. But instead, here I am, locked up in prison. Floor is hard, food's bad, the Roman soldier's body odor is so bad it makes me want to puke even on him right now. But see, that's not what Paul does. Instead of complaining, instead of whining, instead of telling God why God got it wrong, this is what the Apostle Paul penned in a letter to the Christians in Philippians. Philippians 2:14. Do everything without grumbling or arguing. Another version says, do everything without complaining. Do everything without grumbling or arguing, so that you may become blameless and pure children of God, without fault in a warped and crooked generation. That's a pretty high standard, isn't it? Do everything without grumbling or complaining. Whatever you do, wherever you are, in whatever deed or word, do everything without grumbling or complaining. There's a lot of very spiritual reasons why we should live without complaining, folks. Because remember, when you complain, who are you blaming? Blaming God, right? If the weather's bad, you didn't have any control of the weather. People around you didn't have any control of the weather. Man, I hate this rain. It's just... Guess what? You're saying, God, I don't like what you did today. You don't have it right. You needed to check with me, God. That's what our attitude says when we're complaining. It's God's fault. Oh, I admit most of us don't have the uncouthness to actually say, God, you did this, but it's what you're saying. It's what you're implying. But I want to talk about, and I'm going to talk about the spiritual reasons, but I want to talk about a very practical reason why you shouldn't complain. See, there's a doctor named Travis Bradberry. I know, not Ray Bradbury. He's not related to the guy from Star Trek or anything. He's done a lot of research on the idea of complaining. And what he says is that repeated complaining hardwires the brain to complain more. In other words, the more negative you complain, the more likely your brain is going to be triggered to continue to be negative. He and others talk about what it means to just have this kind of negative mindset that before long we enter into what they call a confirmation bias. In other words, you expect something to be bad, therefore you get what you expect. And that was the problem with the Israelites. They were negative when they were in captivity. They were negative when they were free, because their mindset trained them to be even more negative, and it's incredibly dangerous. I don't know about you, but I don't want to go through life complaining about everything and expecting nothing to work. When there's already enough bad in the world, I don't need to add to it. I want to train my mind to find what's good. In fact, that's what we're told to focus on. Isn't that what Scripture says? To focus on what is right and good and pure. So if we're going to do that spiritually, that which is pleasant, which is helpful, which is hopeful, instead of always focusing on what's negative, when you look at the Apostle Paul, the way he lived and what he taught, it would communicate those two big ideas. To me, this is the heart of the message. And then I want to, in a way, that will hopefully motivate and speak to you as it's speaking to me. Because, you know, I preached this message last night, at least the outline. And I was in tears by the time I got to the end of the service. Because it hit me hard that I like to complain. And I've heard myself say, well, my perfect complaint, the mailman. Okay, the mailman is just delivering the mail, right? But I get the mail. I don't want to get the mail because there's never any good news in the mail. All I ever get is bills and bad news. I don't want to go get the mail. I don't want to see it. And I complain about it. Really? Maybe somebody would send me a letter. But I wouldn't expect it. I wouldn't be looking for it. You know why? Because I'm expecting bad news. And I'm telling God, I don't like the way you run the mailman. I don't like the mail you send me, God. See, guys, how insidious this is? How easy it is to fall into that trap where you start complaining and then and then if you don't realize it, you start blaming God for everything wrong in your life. When you should be blessing, when you should be realizing that what he's putting you through might be to transform you, might be to change you. Now, what Paul would have said is, if you can change your circumstances, if there's something negative and you can do something about it, then do something about it. If there are negative circumstances, something that is unpleasant, something that's not right, something you wish you could change, and you can do something about it, then do it. In other words, you're not going to go through life and pretend like everything's okay when it's not. It's not a sin to notice something's not right, but when it boils into sin, might be when we complain and complain and complain and complain and complain and don't ever do anything about it. I used to have a friend of mine. He brought the same sandwich to lunch every day. He liked the potted meat stuff, whatever it's called, deviled ham. And he'd have a deviled ham sandwich every day, and he would complain about the sandwich every single day. And finally, I asked him, why don't you ask your wife to make you something else? If you don't like potted meat that much, why don't you make something else? And he says, oh, my wife doesn't make my lunch. I make my lunch. So you're complaining about a lunch you made yourself. Really? You just wanted something to complain about, didn't you? I mean, you bought you buy it at the grocery store. You make the sandwich. And you're complaining about it? You could change that, you know. If you're going to complain about things you can change, hey, you deserve what you get. If you can change it, change it. But if you can't, then you got a problem. Let me put it this way. Think about Nehemiah in the Old Testament. Nehemiah recognized that the walls of Jerusalem were down, and he was really upset about it. What did he do? Did he run, oh, poor me, oh, woe is me, the walls are down, and they can't do anything, and oh gosh, the people are so vulnerable, and why can't I get somebody else to do something about it? No, what did Nehemiah do? He was bothered about it, but he stepped up and took a serious risk to approach the king, unbidden, to go to Jerusalem and rebuild the walls. But he did something about it. He didn't just stand around and moan and cry about it. He was bothered by it, but he did something about it. If there's something that you dislike, something that gives you a righteous dissatisfaction, if there is a godly discomfort, if there's something you look at and say, it isn't right on behalf of God, don't complain about it. Don't just put comments on the social media or write on Facebook. Get out with your life and do something about it. If there's a negative situation you can change, then bring your game and change it. Then, Paul would also say, if you can't change your circumstances, then you need to change your perspective. If you can do something about it, do something about it. If you can't change your circumstances, change your perspective. Change what you say about it. Change how you think about it. Change what you see in those circumstances. See, what we say in here, what we're talking about here, and it's so powerful, is to see it from God's perspective. Perfect example. I don't know if you guys know who Corrie ten Boom was. She was a Christian lady who was arrested for her faith in Nazi Germany and thrown in a prison camp. She wasn't Jewish. Most people think, oh, only the They only arrested and murdered Jews, but 1 million believers died in Nazi Germany. We just don't never realize that. We never talk about that. Many of them were trying to rescue the Jews, but at the same time, Hitler didn't want anybody to worship anything other than him. He had kind of a God complex. And so, the reality is that Corrie ten Boom watched her grandfather and her sister and her family all die in those prison camps. She's the only one who walked out. And she could have sat there and complained, oh, the food is bad, the rats are horrible, they don't take care of us, they abuse us, they're gassing people. She could have sat there and whined and complained about it. But she came to realize that God was in it. And she used her time in that prison camp to lead others to Jesus Christ. In the midst of the worst situation in the world, she's in there preaching the gospel. Look at Philippians 2:17 and 18. And then we've got Paul. He's chained up to a Roman soldier. He's waiting execution. His dream is to preach the gospel. He's locked in prison. And this is what he says. But even if I'm being poured out like a drink offering on the sacrifice and service coming from your faith, I am glad and rejoice with you all. So you too should be glad and rejoice with me. Hey, guys, they're getting ready to kill me. I'm so glad that I'm being poured, even though I'm being poured out like a drink offering. I'm still glad. And you're sitting there thinking, okay, what does it mean? Drink offering. Okay, and that's one Greek word that's translated in the whole little phrase. It's the word spindo, which means to spend it all. The word is a very powerful little word that his audience would have understood. What the priest would do is they would make a sacrifice to God, maybe like a lamb or the bull, and so they would put it on the burnt offering, and then they would take a drink offering, which would be the most expensive liquid they had. It was usually wine. A lot of times it had honey in it because honey was extremely difficult and expensive to come by. And they would take their most expensive drink, whatever it was, the most, and they would pour it on top of the burnt offering. And that would be their drink offering. And you can imagine you put some liquid on it, really hot. What does it do? It goes, right? And the steam comes up and the smoke comes up and it would burn off. And that would be their offering to take their very expensive prized drink, pour it on the sacrifice, and the smoke would rise into heaven as an incense offering unto God. And it would say, even if I'm being poured out like that, even though I'm being poured into the flames, yet I will rejoice. Now, I know a lot of people think what he's talking about is dying. He's not. He's not talking about his ultimate martyrdom, because when he actually died, he's talking about surrendering his life now. I wholeheartedly believe he was talking about he was not just talking about his ultimate death. The verb is a passive present tense, which means even if I am being poured out, not even if one day I'm poured out, but even as my life is oozing away, even right now, his ultimate death wasn't a sacrifice on his mind. It was a daily life that was the sacrifice. That is why Paul said elsewhere, offer your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and acceptable to God, and this is your official spiritual act of worship. And guys, worship isn't just lifting up your hands to a holy God or singing songs, but worship is every single day, offering your life wherever you are, even chained up in a Roman prison, as an offering to God. This is my act of worship. God, I'm yours. Today, it's Monday. I'm completely yours. I offer my life to you. Do with me as you will. That's my spiritual act of worship. And that's what Paul's saying. I'm being poured out like a drink offering. In other words, my life is completely and utterly committed to you today, at this moment. And I'm constantly doing that. I'm constantly serving where you sent me. I'm constantly doing what you call me to do. Just exactly how does Paul, in prison, chained to a Roman soldier, and offer praise and worship to God? Well, let me tell you how. Paul was not the center of his own story. Remember we talked about earlier When you complain, you're complaining to God. But when you're complaining, what you're saying is, I'm in command. I'm the center of my story. I'm on the throne. God took a negative circumstance because Jesus was at the center of his story. Jesus was on the throne. And Paul changed his perspective about it in such a way that it could impact what God was able to do through his negative circumstances. That's why Paul said this. And don't miss the power of what he says. Here he is, chained up 24 hours a day. Gets a different Roman guard every 8 hours. Here's a new one over and over again. Here's what Paul says. This is so powerful. He says, now I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that what has happened to me has actually served to advance the gospel. Guys, he's not complaining. He's changed his perspective. And he's seen the power, the goodness of God in it. What's happened to me has actually moved the message of Jesus forward. He's essentially saying, as a result, it's become clear through the whole palace guard. All these soldiers, they know it. Everyone else knows it. What do they know? They know that I am in chains for Christ. Look, guys, think about it. Here he is. He gets a new guard every 8 hours. He gets to proclaim the gospel to them. And if they rotate through, you probably saw. Assuming they, some of them surely are duplicated, but, they didn't work 7 days a week. They had days off, too. So, you got 3 guards, 3 plus another 2. So he got at least 5 guards a week. If they run shifts, if they came, but assuming they did, then unlikely they were in the same. So they probably, he could have had as many. Doing math here, sorry. 21 guards a week. 21 guards a week. 7 days a week, 3 guards a day. To proclaim the gospel to. All of them captive audience. The real prisoner, guys, was the guard. He couldn't go anywhere. Every 8 hours, he got fresh prospects, virgin ears. He got someone new, one of the most powerful people in all of Rome, chained up to my arm for an 8-hour sermon that I write new for them every day. You think he's the prisoner here? You got no idea how God would see as negative to advance the gospel. Paul's saying, this isn't my plan. This isn't what I would have chosen. And there's a lot of reasons what I could probably complain about. Because I can't change my circumstances, I'm changing my perspective. I know that my God works in all things to bring about good according to his purpose for those who love and called according to his purpose. I see my God doing something. I don't know who this is going to speak to, but I'm going to